Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And today I want to discuss a topic that has been much requested on this channel. We're going to look at the frankly tragic life of Juana of Castile. In doing so, we will encounter a woman whom history has often chosen to remember, I'd argue perhaps misremember, as Joanna the Mad. Hers is a life that's been bound up in myths, and many of which, I'd argue, were created by those around her during her own lifetime. And so, with that in mind, the truth, whatever that might really mean, may be hard for us to come by. But it's certainly not the first time that that's been the case on this channel, and after all, nevertheless, we are able to take a look at some of the narratives that have been attached to her, and we can therefore draw our own conclusions and or interpretations of her from there. Was Juana mentally unstable? A violent danger to herself and or others? Or was her allegedly erratic behaviour simply the result of trauma, caused by the cruelty of those around her? Or were reports of her madness nothing more than a wicked fiction, designed simply to keep her from her rightful place and inheritance? Let's take a look at it. In 1469, Isabella of Castile married her second cousin, Ferdinand of Aragon. In doing so, they would ultimately be able to unite vast swathes of Spain. Together, they would also complete the so-called Reconquista in 1492, when they took the then Emirate of Granada away from its last Nazarene ruler, Mohammed XII. After this point, and together, they sat at the head of one of the leading European powers. It is, however, worth remembering that Castile and Aragon were only joined by the marriage of these two people. If one party should predecease the other, the survivor was going to have difficulty, perhaps impossibility, in maintaining control over their former spouse's territory. And that control is what the new might of Spain was founded on. By the end of 1485, Isabella and Ferdinand had 5 living children. Isabella had been born in 1470. She would become the Queen Consort of Portugal in 1497. John, or Juan, Prince of Asturias, had been born in 1478. Joanna, or Juana, who is our focus for today, was born in 1497. Maria would be born in 1482, and she would become the Queen Consort of Portugal in 1500, which, if you're paying attention, probably gives you a clue that her eldest sister, who had also held that title and indeed husband before her, would not live to be a widow. The last surviving child of Isabella and Ferdinand was Catalina, or Catherine of Aragon. She was born in 1485. And she would go on to marry first Arthur, Prince of Wales, in 1501, and then King Henry VIII in 1509. When Juana was 16 years old, in 1496, she married the Habsburg Duke of Burgundy. He was known as Philip the Fair, or Philip the Handsome, on account of his dashing good looks. And as was to be expected, she then moved to live with him in Flanders, which was then in the Burgundian Netherlands. But to further connect the houses of Habsburg and Trastámara, Philip's sister Margaret was married to Juana's elder brother, Juan, in the following year, which was 1497. But within months of this marriage, Juan would fall ill, and he would die at Salamanca on the 4th of October, 1497. His pregnant widow Margaret was grief-ridden by his loss. She would ultimately give birth to a premature daughter just 6 months later. Sadly, the infant did not survive the birth. I'm sure that none of us are surprised that the intention would have been that Juan should succeed his parents as the king of a now unified Spain. But he was their only surviving son. And so now, the heir to this new Spain is going to be one of his sisters. According to the expectations of the time regarding the gender roles between a wife and her husband, that's going to mean that Spain could, indeed likely would, come under the control of another nation. Around 2 months before his death, Juan's elder sister Isabella had, after all, married Manuel I of Portugal. Did this mean that Portugal would be able to absorb Spain as one of its own dominions? As it was, Isabella would give birth to a son and heir the following year, on the 23rd of August, 1498. But Isabella would die soon after the baby's birth. He had been named Miguel. Now, as Isabella had predeceased her parents, that meant that her husband lost out on the chance to unify Portugal and Spain under his own personal governance. But they did have their son, and he would be recognised as the heir of the crowns of Portugal, Aragon, and Castile. On the 19th of July, 1500, just before this little boy's second birthday, Miguel would pass away. And with his death, any hopes of a unified Spain and Portugal, understandably, utterly disappeared. It was Juana that was now the heiress presumptive to her parents' crowns, as well as being the mother of 2 children so far. Eleanor had been born in 1498, and Charles had been born in 1500, around 5 months before the death of his aunt and cousin. By early 1507, Juana and Philip would have 4 more children, making 6 children in total, and all of these children would survive into adulthood. And I'm prepared to be accused of being overly sentimental, perhaps a little bit romantic, but I would say that the survival of these children is perhaps one of the only bright spots in the sea of tragedies that will come to swirl around Juana. Because let's remember, within the space of 3 years, she has lost 2 siblings and a nephew, but that's not all. More is yet to come. And I think it's also worth pointing out that during this period, Juana is resident in a foreign court. The eyes of that court are upon her. And at the same time, she's also being both observed and advised by individuals who have been sent by her parents to ensure that she remained as diplomatically advantageous as possible. Juana had been handpicked by her parents to fulfill this diplomatically important and sensitive role. They recognised her intelligence, her gifts, and to further them, they ensured that she was incredibly well educated, as all of their children would be. I mean, after all, do we not make a lot of the very great gifts that Juana's youngest sister Catalina was able to display from the very time she first arrived in England? Let's be clear. The children of Spain were brilliant, and they were educated to excel, and Juana was no different. Now, one ambassador to the court of Philip did raise concerns about the apparent strength of Juana's faith, but as he spent more time with her, he ultimately came to be sympathetic towards her, particularly when he recognised her isolation and indeed her frustration as she sought to do her diplomatic duty to both her new and old lands at a court where far too many people were sympathetic to the French. And the French should, at least as far as Juana and her parents were concerned, be viewed only as a common enemy. On top of this, in addition to being politically sidelined at her own husband's court, Juana also had to contend with him being frequently unfaithful to her. And all accounts point to her being deeply in love with him. In fact, some go further, claim that she was infatuated, perhaps even morbidly obsessed with her husband. And either way, whatever the case may have been, the behaviour must have been painful for her. And so Juana was reportedly, perhaps understandably, frustrated and downcast. Her mood was low. What we aren't getting, though, are any reports of signs of dangerous mental instability. She also seemingly did not outwardly challenge her husband. There are no reports of outbursts of fury or even disappointment, because after all, the other thing that Juana had been raised to understand was the need for total wifely subservience. She would be expected to do as she was told by her husband, and if his wishes threatened her place or that of her parents and dynasty, then she may have to suppress her own beliefs, her own needs, her own wants, in the name of obedience. At best, she could perhaps strategize ways to resist or to frustrate his plans, but outward rebellion would be something that would win her few friends and less support. In 1504, Juana's mother Isabella fell ill, and her daughter, who was now herself a mother of 4, returned to Castile to visit her. At this time, mother and daughter reportedly had some form of disagreement, and the sources differ. But some of them seem to paint Juana as being very, very unreasonable, even swearing at her mother and using the most disgraceful terms towards her. Is this the start of a narrative about Juana's mental instability? Did it actually happen? Was she really violently verbally abusive to her mother? Was there even a disagreement? If there was, I wonder if the cause of it was that Isabella had chosen this moment to inform her daughter that she had decided that Ferdinand, Juana's father, Isabella's husband, should be allowed to continue to have sway in Castile after Isabella's death, which would mean that Juana's husband Philip was to be excluded. Did she tell her that she intended that her father should be the one to govern her dominions until Juana's son Charles had reached his majority? Certainly, when Juana attempted to return to her husband, she was prevented from leaving. It is said that this is because she would have had to travel through France to get back to her husband, and at that time, Castile was at war with France. Juana reportedly made the argument that she was not at war with France and thus should be free to leave. For those who wish to paint her as mentally unstable, they point to this as a sign of her being unaware of the gravity of the situation or of being prepared to take unnecessary risks. However, Juana is not wrong. Her husband Philip was not at war with France. In fact, as we have discussed in this video, Juana's own diplomatic hopes were continuously frustrated at his Francophile court, and so, if any daughter of Spain could expect safe conduct through France at this time, surely it's going to be Juana. Certainly, that's what she believed, when she fought against her detainment in the strongest possible terms. Some have painted the strength of her complaints as erratic, even unstable. Another brick in the wall of the claims of her mental unfitness. Eventually, though, she was permitted to leave. A few months later, on November the 26th, 1504, Queen Isabella died. Her daughter Juana was now the Queen of Castile. But this new queen entered seclusion as she went into mourning. Her father would find himself enraged when his ambassadors were prevented, unable to communicate with her directly, but instead were forced to deal with her husband. Over the coming weeks, months, indeed years, Ferdinand and Philip would wrestle over Castile, while Juana chose, or was forced, to remain out of sight and silent. While her husband and father set about their posturing, including minting rival coins that pictured themselves with her, Juana was confined. Her letters were intercepted, and reports of her growing mental instability were being circulated. Nevertheless, when Juana and Philip were shipwrecked on the coast of England at the start of 1506, they were both welcomed to the court of King Henry VII, and at this time, Juana was reunited with her little sister Catherine at Windsor. So here she is, being allowed out in public in this potentially diplomatically charged setting, and seemingly she is able to both control and comport herself in such a way that her behaviour did not generate concerned reports. Gillian B. Fleming recounts a moment that occurred on the 28th of June 1506, so just a few months after the impromptu visit to the English court. This event took place at the castle of Benavente. On that date, Philip had informed Juana that her father and he had signed a treaty, one that ceded Castile to Philip in such a way that Juana was completely excluded from its governance. Fleming explains that after learning of this, and, quote, feigning indifference, Juana expressed a wish to visit the famous gardens, but as she turned back to the castle, she suddenly galloped off, so I'm assuming that at this point she's on horseback, across the park and down the hill, leaving her escorts dumbfounded. The alarm was raised. Philip's German soldiers gave chase. Juana took refuge in a bakery or flour mill, and there she spent the rest of the day, the night, and the following day, surrounded by hundreds of infantry. Philip argued that it, meaning this act of flight, demonstrated her unfitness to assume the mantle of a ruling queen, and asked the deputies to the Cortes, which is the Castilian parliament, to agree to her imprisonment. Others saw it as a desperate bid to escape captivity by foreign forces, poised to seize charge of kingdoms that were hers by right. Juana would escape her husband's captivity soon enough, because Philip would fall ill. Some would even allege that, in truth, he had been poisoned by Juana's father, Ferdinand. Philip would die on September the 25th, 1506. Juana was once again the Queen Regnant of Castile. The power was once again hers. However, her behaviour after this loss is frequently something that's referenced as evidence of the truth of the narratives of her mental illness. Because rather than shore up power, following a disastrous 2 years of political invisibility while she was effectively imprisoned by her husband, rather than try and stabilise her now plague-ridden land, Juana allegedly became obsessed with spending time with Philip's corpse. I do want to flag up that while all of this is going on, the excessive mourning, the corpse obsession, Juana is pregnant. And so presumably that means that during her period of imprisonment, at a time when her husband is claiming that she is so mentally unstable she must be incarcerated and is totally unfit to rule, that same husband is still keen to visit her and to sleep with her. And so I invite you to draw your own conclusions about Philip's true views with regards to Juana's mental capacity if we bear this pregnancy in mind. After Philip's death, Juana refused to allow women to be around his body, and this has been read as a continuation of her reported obsessional jealousy over him and of her apparent hatred of his lovers, a narrative that was, at least in part, fostered by Philip himself during his life. Indeed, it is reported that she went so far as to physically attack one of his mistresses, which has been also used to paint her as being dangerously, violently unstable. She became fixated on travelling with Philip's body. She refused to part with him until he was buried in the Royal Chapel of Granada. But the journey back to Granada would take months. And over this time, it is said that she had his coffin opened regularly so that she could hug him and kiss his feet. And I can certainly see how this would be viewed as an extreme behavioural response. But Bethany Aram writes that, quote, such accounts of Juana's eternal attachment to Philip, however degrading to the Queen, advanced her main ends. Following the death of her husband, Juana clung on to two political ambitions. One, to avoid a second marriage, which could only complicate her situation and prejudice her children. And two, to secure the inheritance of her offspring, particularly that of her eldest son in Castile. The Queen's legendary devotion to Philip furthered both goals. While refusing to bury Philip's corpse before it reached Granada, where the remains of Queen Isabella lay, Juana managed to fend off eager suitors, including Henry VII of England. Now, I don't know about you, but I for one think it's pretty interesting that King Henry VII, a monarch that we know met Juana during that period when her husband was insisting that she be imprisoned due to her apparent dangerous insanity, the fact that that monarch is unconcerned enough about it to want to pursue her for a bride is, I think, interesting. Unless, of course, any connection with Spain is enough to overlook this apparent dangerous madness. Unless, of course, on the other hand, the truth is that there simply wasn't that much, if anything, to overlook. Aram continues, quote, "By honouring Philip's remains and staging elaborate exequies around them, the Queen publicised her husband's status as a legitimate King of Castile." Juana's grief-ridden journey was halted in late 1506 to allow her to give birth to her final child, Catherine, at Torquemada on the 14th of January 1507. Juana would be parted from her eldest son and his sisters, excluding Catherine, because they were placed in the care of her sister-in-law and their paternal aunt, Margaret, back in Flanders. It was Margaret who would raise them. Juana's other son, Ferdinand, was back in Castile, and as I've mentioned, her newborn Catherine had remained with her. When Juana did make her return to Castile eventually, she would find that plague and famine had caused devastation and were continuing to cause political unrest. This unrest was coupled with, indeed exacerbated by, ongoing rumours of the Queen's mental instability. Now, these rumours may, I think, arguably have been started by her husband Philip, and they had gone unchallenged for a long period of time. But on top of this, I can certainly see that Juana's behaviour following Philip's death is not going to do much to dissuade people from seeing her as being unstable. I can see how her contemporaneous behaviour would only have exacerbated things, and thus how it might be difficult for Juana to assert her authority over her dominions, regardless of the actual truth of her mental state. Juana's father Ferdinand chose not to step in to defend her, or to offer her any support for her to be able to rule those lands in her own right. Instead, as summer came, and as plague and famine began to subside, Ferdinand chose that moment to make his return to Castile. He was back in July 1507 and willing and able to capitalise on the growing sense of hope and relief in that place. He demanded that Juana give up her rights and powers, to which she acquiesced. In 1509, Juana was confined at Tordesillas. Her servants were replaced with those that were loyal to her father. In 1516, Ferdinand died, and so Juana was now, nominally at least, Queen of Aragon as well as of Castile. But she would be encouraged to allow her 16-year-old son Charles to co-rule with her. But as Charles did not release her, what that actually meant was that he would be ruling alone. And then, after the death of Charles's paternal grandfather, Maximilian I, in 1519, Charles inherited his titles and dominions too. He was now Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Charles chose to put Bernardo, the Marquis of Denia, in place as the governor of his mother's household, and Denia, among other things, would keep Charles up to date on the state of his mother through a series of letters. But if we return to the work of Bethany Aram, she points out that, quote, Denia's letters were designed to remind Charles of his importance and the need to reward his family, rather than provide an impartial view of the Queen. Further complicating matters, the Marquis of Denia actively assisted the king in creating a fictional world to confine and undermine Juana. Dania even admitted that he had encouraged his royal charge to write to both her father Ferdinand and to the Emperor Maximilian, who we know, and I'm sure on some level at least Juana also knew, were both dead. But Dania had set about convincing Juana that they were both still alive. In modern parlance, we call that behaviour gaslighting. Dania and Charles went further, though, because they conspired to make Juana believe that an outbreak of plague had killed everyone in any city or town that she had voiced a hope to visit. And to make this macabre narrative more convincing, they staged funeral processions to go past her palace numerous times each day. In 1520, a rebel group sought to free Juana and to return her to power. When they encountered her, they announced that she was completely sane, but it was their intention to use her, to challenge the current Habsburg regime, the regime that was being overseen by her son Charles. Juana would not comply, and at this moment, the rebel group appeared to have changed their mind and decided that she needed to be cured. At the very least, they tormented and threatened her. But regardless, Juana remained resolute in her loyalty to her son. Charles would not repay that loyalty with release. Juana would remain at Tordesillas for 35 more years. She would ask for news of her children regularly as they grew, as they married, and in some cases had children of their own. All the while, she remained confined, as one by one each of her siblings, and even one of her children, her daughter Isabella, predeceased her. Juana, Queen of Castile and Aragon, died a prisoner on the 12th of April 1555 when she was 75 years old. She was buried with her mother, father and husband in the Royal Chapel of Granada. But her mental state would continue to be the prime focus of any discussion whenever her life and legacy were mentioned. And with the rise of psychiatry, numerous posthumous diagnoses have been offered, from depression to psychosis to schizophrenia, or even trauma that may have been caused by loss and or mistreatment. While there are others who will assert that Juana was never ill at all, and that name, Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, was part of a carefully crafted fiction. A fiction that was shaped by a succession of men and their supporters who simply wished to wield her power as their own. But what do you think of Juana's mental state? Was she locked away for her safety and or for the safety of others? Or was she a queen who was betrayed and falsely imprisoned, first by her husband, then by her father, and finally by her son, all of whom she appears to have remained utterly devoted to? Or could it all in some way be true? Did the deceptive tactics that were put in place to wrestle power away from her become the cause of a real mental illness? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. Or you can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box, so please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful, and if you did, please consider sharing with your friends, and in fact, if you like my channel, please let your friends know about it too. Please also let me know you like this video by hitting the thumbs up. And I'd love it if you would subscribe to the channel. And if you think you're subscribed, now's an ideal time just to have a little check. Make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. And while you're there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, you will find there's a little bell icon. Hit that bell icon, and then when the drop down appears, you can hit all. That bell icon is beside the subscribe button. When you do that and hit all, YouTube will allegedly tell you when I've either next uploaded or when I am about to go live, which I am now doing on a Monday evening. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing. And I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.